big raindrops were pattering on the dark windows. It was one of those disgusting summer holiday rains which, when they have begun, lasted for a long time. For weeks, till the frozen holidaymaker grows used to it, and sinks into complete apathy. This is the opening to Bad Weather, a short story by the famed Russian writer Anton Chekhov, describing a man's wife and his mother, desperately awaiting for his return to their cabin after days of anguish and wither under the atmosphere of the dreary city. Here's what that day would look like on the We Forecast channel, and here's what it will look like in Japan. Released on December 19, 2006, it took 37,412 days since Chekhov died for humanity to cook up another emotionally touching meteorological masterpiece. To fulfill its mission of showing the weather everywhere on Earth from the same console you can play sexy poker on, a globe floats in the calming abyss of space. The user is invited to view the weather as beautifully realistic cloud formations, mimicking the ethereal sky. Except for in Japan. Everywhere else in the world, you see these realistic sun rays in clouds of nuanced shades, thunder crackling down from above in raucous yellow streaks. Go to Japan and you get the bluntest symbols you could imagine. You got a sun, you got a cloud, and it's partly cloudy. Further, what's the deal with using an umbrella to represent rain? Why is snow represented by a snowman? Why is everything so cartoony? It turns out that the developers of the We Forecast channel were flustered about the differences themselves. Koichi Kawamoto, Tadachi Matsushita, Ryusuke Suzuki, and Kuniharu Fujikawa all gave some pretty interesting insight into making a weather app for an international audience. Matsushita thought that the pointy red sun and umbrella was just the standard. They were also baffled by all of the weather types that were not typically represented in Japanese weather forecasts. Nintendo of Europe actually made them add in sleet, hail, grapple, and haze. They didn't have anything like that over there. Suzuki even mentions that he was shocked at the idea of a thunderstorm as a distinct type of weather. He viewed it more so as something the reporter just mentions alongside a rain icon. I bring up this morsel of information not because I'm a naive little zoomer child with an incredibly myopic view of material culture viewed through the rest of rose-tinted glasses. Okay, that's actually a big reason. But rather because it shows that there's a bizarre diversity of international weather symbols, and nobody really gets why. It is in that spirit that I want to put an end to this befuddlement, to assuage the souls of the confused masses and reach absolute concord for all weather forecast enjoyers and nominal tolerators. With that, I shall ask the question, why are Japanese weather icons different from everywhere else? Because the viewer retention of my last video was absolute horsewater, I'll give you all the answers straight up. Japanese weather icons can place their heritage to these late 19th century illustrations in a newspaper called the Jiji Shimpo, published by a prominent intellectual by the name of Fukazawa Yukichi. Over the years, Japanese news networks synthesized the illustrations of men with umbrellas and women basking in the sun with clean graphics of both, which became the modern canon. Our friends who made the We Forecast channel seemingly modeled their Japanese symbols after what NHK was using at the time. The latter cloud-based designs can trace their origins back to a fellow named Mark Allen in 1974. He was so miffed at the BBC's meteorological gobbledygook that he made a new set for the laymen for his senior thesis at the Norwich School of Art in 1974. He submitted them to the BBC and they were introduced a year later. They used them on air for the next 30 years. Allen was responding to these esoteric thingamajigs that he was seeing on the BBC, which were stuck to a magnetic board, and were themselves holdovers from the early days where a reporter would just slap some scribbles on a map with a grease pencil. While I can't find any commentary from Allen himself, former BBC graphic designer Micah Ford has given us a handy little poster that explains how the icons are used. The whole system revolves around this cloud over here. Different symbols are plastered onto it to create one cohesive image. Some rays of sun or a little moon peeking out signal showers, not in the sense of rain, but in the sense of intermittent clear and cloudy skies. Essentially, what your average filbert would call partly cloudy. If there's stuff falling out of said clouds, then that shows up as one of these precipitation icons. One drop means a little, and two means a lot. Lastly, a light cloud signifies light cloud cover, and a dark black one is a bit heavier. I cannot find an equivalent primer on the Japanese canon of weather symbols. Yet, when contrasted with Allen, there are a few key differences. There's this umbrella to show rain and this Japanese snowman, or yukidaruma, to signify snow. Even with the seemingly more traditional symbols, there are a fair bit of subtle differences that make a big impact. The clouds are a lot more puffy, and the sun is this reddish-orange orb with some pointy triangles or lines. To display new forms of weather, different symbols are placed together. In this NHK broadcast from 18 years ago, the sun and cloud overlap to signify partly cloudy, but the snowman and cloud stand together to signify intermittent snowy showers. In this NTV forecast from about a month ago, clouds and umbrellas stand side by side to signify much the same thing. There's also this arrow, which signifies a transition between one weather state to another. International forecasts tend to just show the changes by hour. All of this is to say that the differences in weather forecasting go far deeper than a couple of different symbols. The BBC-style international approach graphs a bunch of assets onto a cloud to efficiently convey showers and precipitation. What that leads to is a reductive image of the landscape that's outside. The Japanese NHK-driven approach relies on a series of separate images that are sort of read together by context. These differences in canons present fundamentally different ways to produce meaning through signs, or what wearers of fancy pants might call semiotics. What are the roots of each of these design philosophies? To understand this, we need to go a bit deeper into their inspirations. When making his symbols, Alan was inspired by the then-contemporary work of German designer Otto Aicher, co-founder of the influential design school HFG Ulm. Alan's symbols take inspiration from Aicher's pictograms for the 1972 Munich Olympic Games, one of his most well-known projects. As far as I'm aware, Alan did not specify where he took inspiration from Aicher in his process, but we can draw many similarities. For one, both Alan and Aicher convey meaning through use of flat, clean line work without any gradients. Aicher constructs all of his figures exclusively through 90 and 45 degree angles, creating a consistent design language that says, hey, maybe you should pay attention to this if you're super lost or want to get to a specific sporting event, because I'm the sign that clearly tells you to do that. Alan is not as dogmatic in his approach as Aicher in using straight lines, but the rain droplets do move down from the cloud at an implied 30-degree line. It's enough to say to any errant eye-haver, hey, maybe if you want to know what the weather is, was, or will be depending on the situation, maybe you want to look at me for a few seconds so you can make an informed decision about how to plan your life. Aicher was quite fond of the age-old tradition of publishing a large volume of polemical word vomit about the nature of design, so we have a paper trail of a fair bit of his thoughts. The World as Design, a collection of essays written towards the end of Aicher's life, outlines his ethos towards branding projects like the Munich Olympics. Design is company philosophy made concrete. Just as human beings no longer allow themselves to be divided up into soul, body, and mind, the technical element, as such, is always in appearance form. Also a technical element. Similarly, Alan's icons didn't make up some new aesthetic just for decorative purposes. Every graphic was tailor-made for telling the weather. Though he likely didn't have any lofty socio-political ambitions with his design like Aicher did, it is important to note that these symbols align the BBC with a sleek and professional graphic style. Even the ways in which Aicher and Alan make their icons readable are almost identical. Just as Alan uses a standardized cloud in a variety of contexts to convey different types of weather, Aicher uses a posse of stickmen doing different things to convey each of the sports and facilities at the Olympics. This method of pictorial representation is nothing new. One of the cleanest antecedents to this Aicher pictogrammy business is the interwar-era Isotype program, a series of communicative images developed by a team of graphic designers headed by Otto Neurath, Marie Neurath, and Gerd Arntz. Through the 20s and 30s, Isotype developed from a data visualization tool to a vision for a universal language. The overall ethos behind Isotype can best be summarized by this sentence Otto Neurath wrote in all caps, foreshadowing the literary tradition of the 137-post-long angry Twitter thread by about 80 years. Words make division, pictures make connection. Following the devastation of Europe after the First World War, Neurath saw such a project as a way to unify the manners in which information is relayed to people across the continent who all spoke different languages. Isotype is fundamentally built off of signs, which are simplified images that convey some sort of concept the reader would be familiar with, like a person or a piece of coal or... Much like Alan's weather icons, meaning in Isotype is conveyed from composites of multiple symbols that form one. For example, there's a symbol for a worker and a symbol for coal. Put the logo thing from the coal symbol on the worker and you get a coal worker. You get a symbol for a man, put a hat on him, and get a symbol for a reductive group of hundreds of thousands of people that only reflects white colonial hegemony in its arbitrarily constructed framework of race. Let's go back to that man for a minute, the one that doesn't have any hats. You can probably see where Aicher got his inspiration for depicting people. And furthermore, you've probably seen other institutions use similar designs in whatever public place exists in the peripheral vision of your phone screen. These symbols are what graphic designer and curator Ellen Lupton calls Helvetica men, after the typeface that often accompanies it. I mention all of this because Alan essentially made the Helvetica cloud, an anchoring symbol made up of clear, thick black lines that has the subtlety of a thing that is metaphorically blunt. Alan took a tradition that had already been developing in graphic design at the time, and just applied it to the weather. The Japanese convention doesn't have as clear-cut of an origin story. As mentioned earlier, the first instance of weather icons being used in Japan comes from the Jiji Shimpo newspaper on April 4th, 1883. The man responsible for publishing the newspaper, Fukuzawa Yukichi, was one of the most well-known Japanese writers and political theorists of the day. What is important to know about Fukuzawa for the purposes of this discussion was that he was an ardent scholar on matters of the West, particularly in the Dutch and English languages he was fluent in. He made a few extensive travels to the United States and Europe within his lifetime, and from there became an author whose work championed the implementation of Western liberalism and modernizing Japan to be in such a tradition. The Jiji Shimpo newspaper was one such arm of this project. Now, for all that the Jiji Shimpo attempts to be a Western-style newspaper, this use of illustrations for the weather was actually completely novel. A precursory look at contemporary papers like the New York Times and LA Times in the US, which Fukuzawa was likely familiar with, gave weather reports with just words. Consequently, the Jiji Shimpo was breaking new ground and using pictures to tell the weather, about 90 years before Allen's attempt. Let's look at these images. There aren't any standard Helvetica men. Each of the people depicted here are unique, with distinct relations to the weather around them. This leads me to the question I ask when I wake up every morning. Why are there people? This is certainly one of the biggest diversions compared to Allen's clouds. They aren't showing any cartoon representations of clouds in the sky. People are at the forefront instead. This lady basks in the sun with a folded parasol. This old man sits down and looks up at the thick swaths of clouds. This man wearing a hat trudges through the snow. The man here shelters himself from the rain with a jacket and an umbrella. The umbrella is probably the clearest legacy of the Jiji Shimpo on weather symbols today. The transition to the modern symbols is a bit dicey, but I can glean that as televised weather broadcasts became a thing with the NHK in the mid-20th century, they started to annotate maps of Japan with these banner-esque designs that seem like prototypes of the more modern ones that we see on the We Forecast channel that totally did not release almost 20 years ago. Nevertheless, what the umbrella represents in its persistence is the representation of weather in the form of a suggested action rather than the actual formation of clouds in the sky. The umbrella is a tool. It's a piece of material culture that humans invented to shield themselves from the rain. Therefore, the use of the umbrella as a rain icon in essence says to the viewer, hey, you should use an umbrella now. A little outline of a rain cloud with some blue droplets. Well, all that really says is, there's a large amorphous mass of white flying through the empty void of blue, perpetually out of reach and yet spiting us with the onslaught of 1,000 liquid arrows. And alas, no signal to allay our quandary is given, leaving us to discover the umbrella for ourselves. Well, it's quite a pickle. Dare I say a vinegar-rich, slimy gherkin that we found ourselves in, trying to find the core reason for all this. It would perhaps be illuminating if an influential Japanese industrial designer could write a polemic explaining the sociological value of tool use in society in the latter portion of the 20th century. Kenji Ikuin is one of the most influential industrial designers and design philosophers of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. One of his notable works that you may have seen is the Kikkoman soy sauce bottle, which currently pulverizes my spine. He wrote a bit on tools, one may say an introduction to the world of tools. He outlines the prevalence of the tool as a key part of post-war Japanese society, exacerbated by the devastation and rebuilding necessary after the War of Jenkins' Ear. Ikuin places an immense cultural responsibility on the idea of a tool, which he implicitly defines as any man-made thing or machine that is meant to improve or otherwise alter human lives. Ikuin defines them as the thumbprints of man, inciting change from the inside. They inhabit empty spaces and subtly signal narrative and emotion through their existence. He even argues that in the incredibly advanced era of 1969, newfangled tools like airplanes, radios, and trains completely upend our basic frameworks for sensual perception. I think Ikuin puts it eloquently in this quote. TV sets are said to be turning our entire population into idiots, but they also enable faster typhoon broadcasts and educate us through pictures. Wait, that's the topic of the video! Okay, so in this framework the weather icon is kind of a tool by Ikuin's definition. It's not a physical object, but it certainly is a man-made thing that alters our thoughts and lives. But the umbrella as an object certainly is a tool. People use umbrellas all around the world, so why is this specifically a Japanese thing? We could take Ikuin at his word and say this is just a facet of Japanese culture, but we can go a little deeper. For starters, there's that brief mention of typhoons. Japan generally has a very intense rainy season in the summer that prompts the use of umbrellas. The We Forecast channel folks do mention the critical nature of rain in forecasts. A developer commented, "You just cannot do without knowing the chance of rain in Japan." Consequently, Japan has a huge umbrella culture. According to a 2022 survey conducted by WNI Weather News, the average amount of umbrellas owned per person across Japan is 4.2. Umbrella lockers are quite common in public spaces, and looking back at those Jiji Shimpo images, we can see similarities to previous depictions of people using umbrellas and parasols in woodblock prints that have weather suggested more by people's clothing and actions more than any explicit cloud formations. So, we have an idea of where the Western symbols come from, and we know where the Japanese symbols come from. And it all just boils down to Japan being very wet. But, as an astute viewer may notice, there are many places which are, in fact, very wet that are not Japan. Korea is also very wet. Do they use the umbrella? Well, sometimes. India is a place that has a relatively consistent monsoon season. Do they use the umbrella? Well, the India Meteorological Department does, to specifically indicate the tab where you click on to view monsoon weather. What about Floridians? Surely, in having the same Köppen climate classification as Japan, they would have value for the trusty umbrella, right? No, of course not. The mere existence of Florida disproves any notion of any universal rational order. Their weather symbol preference comes entirely from the higher powers. Let's talk about that higher power, the Weather Channel. So, thus far, I've been anachronistically comparing a standard of Japanese symbols from the mid-2000s and British symbols from the 1970s. But in spite of using a BBC-derived symbol language, the Weather Channel ended up developing an identity all on its own. Since its start in 1983, the Weather Channel has been critical in setting the stage of the overall canon of American and perhaps even global forecast symbols. Even beyond the symbols, the Weather Channel is extremely important for creating a largely impersonal user experience through its automated local on-the-8s forecasting system. The symbols had to do a lot of heavy lifting. How'd the graphic designers at the Weather Channel respond? They made Microsoft Word clip art. The first few years of automated Weather Channel forecasts did not have any graphics at all, but starting in 1990 they gave us these signature thick outlines and wispy curves. While it seems like a large departure from the minimalist Mark Allen designs, they still use the system of putting a bunch of symbols together in one image. But the way the Weather Channel does it is a lot more artistic. They don't just have one cloud, they have the standard flat cloud, but also this tall, kinda stormy cloud. They can be used separately, together, with the sun, without the sun. An ever-increasing complexity of meteorological phenomena sucker punches the unsuspecting viewer with meteorological word salad. There's sunny, there is cloudy, there is rain, all are present indeed, yet there is also partly cloudy, mostly cloudy, showers, thunderstorms, scattered thunderstorms, isolated thunderstorms, haze, fog. Dare I even mention the absolute syzygy of precipitous happenstance that is the wintry mix. Fast forward to the 2000s. The Weather Channel receives a graphical overhaul. It actually receives a few. With advances in realistic 3D graphics, each subsequent icon moves closer to reality. Animated clouds, rays of sun, subtle rain droplets, that sort of stuff. But then in 2005, across the pond, the unthinkable happens.
Hello there, and welcome to something of a historic weather view, something of an end of an era, the last time most of us will see the weather symbols used in anger, as from the morning the weather will be displayed in a very different manner.
The BBC abandoned their classic symbols for these little photos. They were designed by our aforementioned friend Micah Ford. The abstracted forms are scrapped in favor of these snapshots of the sky. The temperature is displayed in the center of these icons, which Ford says is to consolidate the previously separate weather icon and display. Now, this was part of a much greater BBC rebrand, one that eschewed the discrete symbols for these fluid swaths of rain, shine, and wind. The sun, once a signature feature of weather icons all around the world, is replaced by the dull shine of a clear blue sky. I can't express enough how big of a change this was. For one, it reveals a stylistic difference that is more complex than just Japan versus the West. It's important to note that the Weather Channel, even though its graphics got more realistic, stuck to the overall structure that was established in the 90s. The 2000s were really when the forecaster termites started spewing forth from the Mark Allen-based dead log. France TV and TV 5 Monde over in France started to tell the weather using looping backgrounds and a large CGI globe respectively. Regardless of the differences in approach, the big through line is an increasing use of photorealistic graphics. The forecast essentially mirrors what you see outside, but there are still some symbolic embellishments for the sake of readability. You think snow happens to fall like that? No, it's orchestrated. With these symbols, there is less work that needs to be done with interpretation because it's far less abstract. Everyone knows what these represent because they've seen the sky, but the sky is not easily readable, and it's often very murky and fluid. That's what the BBC was going for, and to a forced credit, the icons are relatively consistent between each other, but nevertheless there is a consequence of this new design. A Ford even slightly mentions, anyone's guess as to what it looks like these days, probably got the old symbols back again. These days, they got the old symbols back again. While the fancy graphic effects are still around in live weather reports, they use the old icons in conjunction. It's reflective of a greater trend among weather providers at around this time to bring back the flat icons throughout the 2010s. Apple's weather app is one such example. Back in the early days of the iPhone before the release of iOS 7 in 2013, the app had icons akin to the Weather Channel in the late 2000s. The redesign of the entire iOS operating system moved away from a realistic, detailed look. In the weather app's case, this meant moving to a system based on Aicher and Allen's minimalist language. That same year, the Weather Channel also rebranded themselves and introduced flat icons, moving away from the more realistic style that had characterized the past decade. What is most interesting to me is the fact that the Weather Channel hired a branding firm, Trollback & Company, to helm this project. Although we do have documents of previous weather broadcaster redesigns, this is the first one I could find that expressly was made by an outsider to cultivate a brand image. Specifically, they wanted to redesign and modernize the Weather Channel's brand identity and visual systems to attract younger viewers and communicate the undeniable power of the weather. This redesign was made to make the Weather Channel look interesting. This phrasing indicates that making a new aesthetic was necessary for attracting young people, a group that often gets weather through the default app on their phones. Essentially, weather is a brand now, it's an aesthetic, and so they create a very Aicher-like interface for reasons antithetical to his philosophy. The modern state of weather icons is dominated by this revival of the Aicher-style pictogram that exists in concert with realistic images and video. Apple gives us the most blunt example, with its minimalist icons laying amidst a realistic backdrop of the current conditions, giving us the best of both of the modern Western traditions. The Weather Channel also does this with some of its screen layouts, often putting in some fancy data visualizations into the mix. Even in Japan, the flat cloud has taken over, being used by organizations such as the Japan Meteorological Association and NHK. Others, such as NTV and KBS, carry on with a more cartoony aesthetic. So that's where we are today. The new international style has taken over. You can see the influence of this modern, often Americanized take on Allen's clouds in Russia, China, Kenya, Eswatini, India, and more. Perhaps as all of these are so similar, we will see a melding of weather icon language into flat color cutouts. Except for one! WNI Weather News is an absolute anomaly. It is a chimera of everything discussed thus far, and yet has an identity entirely of its own all the same. It is a beast that takes from all of the weather forecasting can and crams it into these discrete metal boxes. It exists beyond time, perpetually stuck in a never-changing past that nevertheless brings about a prophetic future. It is not just ahead of the times, it is time. Initially founded to provide forecasting to Japanese mariners, it became one of the first weather companies to provide forecasts online in the 1990s and early 2000s. In those days, they just used some simple HTML tables and wonderfully crunchy pre-rendered CG made in much the same way as NHK, umbrellas and all. And then they switched to using Flash. The Wayback Machine doesn't play nicely with that, so I guess the icons are lost media. Gone like the wind. That joke was a lot funnier when I was writing the script because they didn't find the song yet, and I guess it's also worse because it's taken like 6 months to make the video. Yeah. Fortunately, we have a record of forecasts dating back to 2010 from WNI's YouTube channel. The icons from this time look like this. They are white with a brightly colored background very reminiscent of Aicher's pictograms. Your eyes do not deceive you. They use rain droplets instead of an umbrella. Not only that, but there are clouds that do not have the puffy roundness we've come to expect from NHK or the Japanese We Forecast channel. It's strikingly similar to the clouds that started popping up all over the place with all the redesigns we looked at. Even the sun, to a certain extent, resembles Allen's model. Yet, we also see the classic outline of a Japanese snowman, though here it looks more like a peanut. Thank goodness that serves as a decent transition so I don't get anaphylactic shock. Speaking of things that are Japanese, the layout of the symbols very much follow in that tradition. The arrows that we saw before are here, but they're a bit more subtle. They're shown by this chevron over here, what the utter yokels of society like myself may call a pointy bit. The intermittent showers are portrayed by a tiny icon in the lower right-hand corner, completely expunging the existence of partly cloudy from the Weather News lexicon. With this sort of arrangement, the timeline-based format of other weather stations is plunged into the eternal death where only space exists. Much like the inevitable scourge of death, this format has stuck around until the present. As far as I know, it has been the weather news standard for as long as they have been doing filmed weather reports, or at least close to it. Weather news stands as the weather symbol zeitgeist in miniature. It is a concrete and mostly static collection of symbols that borrows from almost everything we've talked about, but it's also an aesthetic. It's a distinct style of branding, even a mode of thought. The compact colored boxes hovering over a map exist as a condensation of the archipelagos of clouds that wander endlessly through the open sky. The winds that bring a soft rustle to the crunchy autumn leaves, the smell of fresh rain, petrichor, dotting an endless field beneath the diffused sunlight of the clouds. Though it may seem ironic, Aicher actually didn't like symbols that much. To hell with symbols, he proclaims. Back to things. The word symbol may be eradicated from our vocabulary. Art may turn to the symbol. A more humane world with the range of intelligence that we have to offer has to abide with the things. For all his work making symbols, Aicher was actually very wary of them in terms of being vapid oversimplifications of complex ideas that do not meaningfully inform. He leverages the symbol of Prussian Chancellor Otto von Bismarck as an example, lamenting his overuse as a symbol of a strong leader. The Germans ought to know more about Bismarck. They ought to know that the Prussian defense budget was 7 times higher than France's, that Bismarck quite consciously saw his political approach as one of blood and iron. They ought to know that he held Democrats up to ridicule. They ought to know how, systemically, he set to seize territory, how he overran peaceful towns and countries. Bismarck hides behind his figure, and so German historians do not dare touch Bismarck as a topic. The symbol hides behind it. The monument hides behind reality. I don't know what Aicher thought or would have thought of weather icons. I don't even think that Aicher's view of Bismarck even maps onto weather icons completely. It seems like Akuan's conception of a tool may be more apt. After all, people need to know if they should wear a coat outside or not. But I'd wager we ought to know a little bit more about the weather, because weather hides behind the symbols we use for it. We ought to know that it isn't just a symbol for a cloud, we ought to feel it. Meditate on the vicissitudes of this ever-changing system of ethereal envelopes that churn around us. We ought to stop checking our phones once in a while to see the chance of rain and go outside. Yet no matter what the weather is, it would be wise to remember the words of Chekhov. People don't notice whether it is winter or summer when they're happy.